My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 33 years old. And on a Saturday afternoon in May, I was standing in the back gallery of Whitcomb Fine Art Appraisals in Chicago, holding a magnifying loupe over a painting that was supposed to be a genuine 1956 Richard Hartley landscape, when I confirmed something I had already suspected for 3 weeks and had been dreading confirming completely. The painting in front of me was a forgery. A very good one. Good enough to have passed 2 previous authentications, good enough to have hung in my grandmother's dining room for 11 years without anyone in my family questioning it. Good enough that if I had not spent the last 9 years training my eye specifically on Richard Hartley's documented brushwork, palette chemistry, and canvas sourcing, I might have missed it myself. But I did not miss it. Because that is what I do. And because 3 weeks earlier, at my cousin Madeline's engagement dinner, my Aunt Patricia had stood up in front of 41 people and told them that I was the reason my grandmother's art collection had lost more than $2 million in value. She had said it the way people say things they have rehearsed. She had said, Vanessa was the one who appraised the collection after Mother passed. If something is wrong with those paintings, that's on her professional judgment, not on this family. The table had gone quiet in the particular way a room goes quiet when something has been said that everyone suspects is not the full story, but no one yet has the information to contradict. I had not contradicted it that night, because I did not yet have the information either. I have it now. I need to back up. All the way to a converted carriage house in Lake Forest, Illinois, where a woman named Eleanor Whitcomb Cole spent 53 years building one of the most quietly significant private art collections in the Midwest, one painting at a time, with the patience and precision of a woman who understood that real value accumulates slowly and is almost never obvious to people who are not paying close attention. My grandmother. She began collecting in 1968, the year she married my grandfather, with a small watercolor she purchased for $11 from a struggling artist at a county fair in Wisconsin. The artist's name was Richard Hartley. He was 24 years old at the time, entirely unknown, and would remain largely unknown for the next 2 decades, painting landscapes of the upper Midwest in a style that critics would later describe as quietly luminous, a phrase my grandmother used long before any critic did, because she had been looking at his work since before anyone else thought to. She bought 31 Hartley paintings over the following 4 decades, almost all of them directly from the artist or his estate, almost all of them for what would now be considered absurdly modest sums, because she bought them when almost no one else recognized what she was seeing. Richard Hartley died in 1994. His reputation began its slow ascent roughly a decade later, the way these things sometimes happen, when a retrospective at the Milwaukee Art Museum introduced his work to a wider audience and serious collectors began to understand what regional specialists had known for years. By the time my grandmother passed away, a single verified Hartley landscape was selling at auction for between $60,000 and $200,000, depending on size, period, and condition. She had 31 of them. I spent every summer of my childhood in that carriage house because my grandmother insisted on it and because I loved being there in a way I have never quite been able to fully explain to people who did not know her. She did not just show me the paintings. She taught me how to see them. She would sit with me in front of a Hartley landscape for 20 minutes at a time, in complete silence, and then she would say something like, "Notice how the light moves through that center section, the way it doesn't quite match the rest of the canvas's temperature. That's not a flaw. That's where he was working out something he hadn't solved yet." The unsolved part is often the most honest part of a painting. I did not fully understand, at 8 years old, that she was training me. I understood it later, when I was 22 and applying for my first position at a regional appraisal house, and the senior appraiser conducting my interview asked me to examine a painting and tell him what I saw, and what I saw, instinctively, without being taught the formal vocabulary yet, was exactly the kind of detail my grandmother had spent a decade teaching me to notice. I got the job. I have been in fine art authentication and appraisal for 11 years since. I specialize specifically in 20th century American regional painters, with a subspecialty, unsurprisingly, in Richard Hartley, whose full catalog I know better than almost anyone currently working in the field, because I learned it standing beside the woman who built that catalog one purchase at a time. My grandmother gave me my first loupe when I was 16 years old. A small brass-cased magnifying loupe, German-made, that she had used herself for 30 years. She pressed it into my hand on a Tuesday afternoon and said, "You have the eye, Vanessa." Not everyone does. Most people look at a painting and see what they expect to see. You're starting to see what's actually there. That's rarer than people think, and it matters more than people understand. I've kept that loupe in the top drawer of my desk at Whitcomb Fine Art Appraisals for 17 years. I use a more advanced digital scope for formal authentication work now, the kind that can analyze pigment composition and canvas weave under magnification levels the human eye cannot achieve alone. But I keep the brass loupe close because some instruments are not about function anymore. Some are about remembering who taught you to see. My grandmother died in the autumn of 2021. She was 81 years old. She died peacefully at home, in the carriage house she had lived in for 53 years, surrounded by the collection she had spent her entire adult life assembling. Her estate was, by any reasonable measure, complicated. Beyond the art, there was the carriage house itself, a modest investment portfolio, and a small collection of jewelry. But the art was the significant asset. 31 Hartley paintings, along with a handful of works by other regional painters she had collected with similar patience, the entire collection conservatively valued, at the time of her passing, at approximately $2.3 million. She had 4 children. My father, Robert Cole, the eldest. My Aunt Patricia, 2 years younger. My Uncle James, for years younger than Patricia. And my Aunt Susan, the youngest, 12 years younger than my father. I am the only one of my generation who works in art. My cousins are accountants, teachers, a dentist, a marketing director. I am the one who, when the estate needed a professional appraisal of the collection for tax and distribution purposes, was the obvious and, frankly, the only qualified choice within the family. My father raised this with me directly, 6 weeks after the funeral, in a phone call that I remember with unusual clarity because of how carefully he phrased it. He said, "Vanessa, the estate needs a formal appraisal of Mom's collection before we can finalize distribution. I know this puts you in an unusual position, being family and also being the professional doing the work. I want you to know that everyone trusts your judgment completely. No one has any concerns about your objectivity." I said yes. I should not have needed to think about it as carefully as I did, but I understood, even then, that conducting a professional appraisal of your own family's most significant asset is a position that carries risk regardless of how careful you are. Because if anything is later found to be wrong with any part of the collection, the easiest place for blame to land is on the person who examined it last. I did not know, at the time, how precisely that risk would materialize, or how deliberately someone in my family would make sure it did. I conducted the appraisal over 6 weeks in the winter of 2021, working in the carriage house itself, painting by painting, with the same methodical thoroughness I bring to every formal authentication. I documented provenance for each piece. I examined brushwork, pigment composition, canvas and stretcher construction, signature characteristics, and condition. I cross-referenced each painting against Richard Hartley's documented catalog, which, as I mentioned, I know better than almost anyone, because I learned to read it standing beside the woman who built it. All 31 Hartley paintings authenticated as genuine. I want to be completely clear about this, because it matters enormously to everything that happened afterward. Every painting I examined in the winter of 2021 was exactly what it claimed to be. My appraisal was accurate. My methodology was sound. My report, which ran to 43 pages with full photographic documentation, was thorough enough that I would have been comfortable defending every page of it under formal professional review, because I have, in fact, had to defend it under exactly that kind of review. The estate was distributed according to my grandmother's will, which specified that the art collection be divided as equally as possible among her 4 children, with specific provisions for which paintings went to whom. Based on a distribution plan she had drafted herself, with her estate attorney, 18 months before her death. My father received 8 paintings. My Aunt Patricia received 8. My Uncle James received 7. My Aunt Susan received 8. The collection was divided. The estate closed in the spring of 2022. I considered the matter finished. It was not finished. It had, in fact, barely begun. 3 years passed. I want to walk you through exactly how those 3 years unfolded, because the timeline matters enormously to understanding what eventually came undone. In the months immediately following the estate's closure, each family member took possession of their share of the collection. My father kept his 8 paintings in his home in Winnetka. My Aunt Susan, similarly, kept hers in her home in Evanston. My Uncle James, who lived in Arizona, had his 7 paintings shipped and professionally installed in his home there. My Aunt Patricia's situation was different, and I did not think much of it at the time, though I think about it constantly now. Patricia had, in the year before my grandmother's death, taken on increasing responsibility for managing the carriage house and, by extension, for the physical security and insurance of the collection while it remained in the estate's possession. This was a practical arrangement. Patricia lived 20 minutes from the carriage house. The rest of us lived farther away or out of state. It made sense for her to be the point person. What I did not understand, what none of us understood, was that this arrangement gave Patricia something the rest of us did not have. Unsupervised, extended physical access to the entire collection for nearly 18 months before the estate formally closed and the paintings were distributed. I have spent considerable time, in the past several weeks, reconstructing exactly what happened during that 18-month window, and what I have found is not speculation. It is documented, traceable, and, as of 3 weeks ago, fully confirmed. Patricia commissioned forgeries of 11 of the 31 Hartley paintings during that period. Not all of them. 11 specifically, the 11 highest valued pieces in the collection, the ones that, based on condition, period, and subject matter, would command the highest prices at serious auction. She used a forger working out of a studio in Indianapolis, a man named Gregory Pell, who I would later learn had a documented history of producing high-quality reproductions sold through channels that operated in a legally ambiguous space between legitimate reproduction art and outright forgery, depending entirely on how the pieces were subsequently represented. Patricia had 11 of my grandmother's most valuable paintings reproduced with extraordinary skill. She then sold the 11 originals through a private dealer network over a period of 14 months, for a combined total that I have since confirmed, through subpoenaed financial records, exceeded $1.4 million. She replaced the originals with the forgeries before the estate's formal distribution. Which means that when I conducted my appraisal in the winter of 2021, 11 of the 31 paintings I examined and authenticated as genuine Richard Hartley landscapes were, in fact, Gregory Pell's reproductions. Already substituted, already in place, already convincing enough to pass my professional examination. I did not catch it. I want to sit with that fact honestly, because it is true, and because understanding why I did not catch it is essential to understanding everything that came afterward. Gregory Pell was, by every account I have since gathered, an exceptionally skilled technical forger. He had access, through channels Patricia arranged, to period-appropriate canvas and pigments. He had studied Hartley's documented brushwork extensively. The forgeries were good enough to pass a careful, professional, methodologically sound appraisal conducted by someone who, at the time, had no specific reason to suspect that any of the paintings in front of her had been substituted. I was looking for whether each painting matched Hartley's known catalog and technique. The forgeries were built specifically to match exactly that. I was not looking for evidence of a substitution scheme orchestrated by my own aunt, because nothing in the situation, at the time, gave me any reason to look for that. This is, I have since learned, almost exactly how the most successful art forgeries succeed. Not through carelessness on the appraiser's part, but through a forger skilled enough to defeat the specific examination being conducted, combined with a complete absence of the contextual suspicion that would prompt a different, more invasive level of scrutiny. I missed it. The forgeries were good enough that I missed it. And for nearly 3 years, I did not know that I had. I need to tell you about the moment everything started to come apart, because it began with something almost embarrassingly small. In March of this year, my uncle James, in Arizona, had his portion of the collection professionally reassessed for insurance purposes as part of a broader review of his estate planning. The insurance appraiser he hired, a man named Daniel Okafor, whom I happen to know professionally through several industry conferences, flagged something unusual about 2 of James's 7 paintings during his examination. Daniel called me directly because he knew of my prior involvement with the collection's original appraisal, and because what he had found concerned him enough that he wanted a second set of eyes before raising it formally with James. He said, "Vanessa, I'm seeing some inconsistencies in the canvas aging on 2 of these pieces that don't match what I'd expect from a 1960s Hartley. I don't want to alarm anyone prematurely, but I think these need a closer look." I drove to Arizona myself 2 weeks later and examined the 2 paintings personally, using the full digital scope equipment I have access to through Whitcomb. Both were forgeries. I sat in my uncle's living room for a long time after confirming that, trying to understand how this was possible, because I had personally authenticated these exact paintings 3 years earlier, and I knew, with complete professional certainty, that the paintings I had examined in 2021 had been genuine, which meant something had happened to them after my appraisal and before they reached my uncle's home in Arizona. I want to walk you through the investigative process that followed, because I did not simply suspect what had happened. I built the case, methodically, the exact way I have been trained to build any authentication case, treating my own family's collection with the same rigor I would bring to any disputed attribution. I requested and received the complete shipping and handling records for every painting distributed from the estate. I cross-referenced timestamps, custody chains, and storage locations. I obtained, through formal request to the estate's attorney, the insurance documentation for the collection during the 18-month period between my grandmother's death and the estate's formal closure. What I found was a pattern that pointed, with increasing and eventually undeniable specificity, to a single 18-month window during which the collection had been in Patricia's primary physical custody, before distribution, before my appraisal had even been conducted on most of the pieces. I examined 3 more paintings from my father's collection in Winnetka, with his permission, framed as a routine follow-up insurance review. 2 were forgeries. I examined 4 from Susan's collection in Evanston. 3 were forgeries. 11 forgeries. Across 3 different family members' homes. All originally distributed from the same source, during the same window, under the same custodial arrangement. I had not yet examined Patricia's own 8 paintings. I requested to do so, framed, again, as a routine insurance and condition review, the kind of follow-up that would not, on its surface, suggest anything specific. Patricia declined. She said her paintings had already been professionally assessed and did not need additional review. She said this in a tone that I recognized, even then, before I had the full picture, as the tone of someone protecting something specific. I did not push the issue directly at that point, because I did not yet have enough to push with. What I had was 11 confirmed forgeries, a documented custody window, and a single family member who had declined examination of the only portion of the collection I had not yet been able to verify. I needed more before I could act on what I was beginning to understand. I got it 3 weeks later, in a conversation I did not expect to have, with a man named Gregory Pell. I found Gregory Pell through a combination of professional research and, frankly, persistence. The forgeries, while excellent, shared certain technical signatures, specific canvas suppliers, a particular pigment mixing technique, a slight but consistent characteristic in how the forger handled signature replication that, once I had identified them across 11 separate paintings, pointed toward a single source with a recognizable methodology. I cross-reference these technical signatures against a database the authentication community maintains, informally, of known forgery cases and flagged methodologies. Gregory Pell's name surfaced in connection with 2 prior, unresolved disputes involving regional American paintings sold through private dealer networks in the Midwest. I did not approach him as an investigator initially. I approached him as a colleague conducting due diligence on a separate authentication matter, which was not entirely untrue, and which gave me an opening to ask questions without immediately revealing the full scope of what I already suspected. Gregory Pell is 61 years old. He has been producing reproduction and, by his own admission once our conversation deepened, forged artworks for nearly 3 decades, operating in exactly the legally ambiguous space I mentioned earlier, where pieces are technically sold as reproductions but represented, through downstream private sales, as originals. He was, somewhat remarkably, willing to talk. Once I made clear that I already had enough technical evidence to identify his work conclusively and that my interest was specifically in understanding the full scope of a commission he had completed roughly 3 years earlier, for a woman matching my aunt's description, involving 11 Hartley landscape reproductions. He confirmed it. Not reluctantly, exactly. Gregory Pell, I would come to understand, operates with the particular moral flexibility of a man who has convinced himself, across 30 years, that his role in these transactions is purely technical. He produces a painting. What happens to that painting afterward is not his concern. He confirmed the commission. 11 Hartley landscape reproductions, completed over a period of roughly 10 months, paid for in installments, by a woman he knew as Patricia. He confirmed the technical specifications I had already identified independently. He confirmed, when I asked directly, that he had been told the reproductions would be used, in his words, to allow the client to keep visual copies of paintings she intended to sell privately, while retaining something to display. I want to be precise about something here. Gregory Pell's account, on its own, does not constitute the kind of evidence that would hold up in a formal legal proceeding without corroboration. But it gave me something I needed badly at that point, which was confirmation that my reconstruction of events was correct, and a name, Patricia, that matched exactly who I already suspected. What I needed next was the financial trail. And that is where my grandmother, in a way I did not expect and am still, weeks later, deeply moved by, had already done most of the work for me. I need to tell you about a document I did not know existed until 4 weeks ago, because it changes everything about how this story actually ends. My grandmother's estate attorney was a man named Harold Whitfield, of Whitfield and Marsh in Lake Forest, who had handled her affairs for over 20 years. I contacted him in April, once I had enough preliminary evidence to suspect what had happened, to ask whether the original estate file contained any documentation I might have missed regarding the collection's condition or provenance prior to distribution. Harold told me something I had not known. My grandmother, in the final 18 months of her life, after her diagnosis, but while she still had full capacity, had become concerned about exactly the kind of vulnerability the collection would face during the estate administration period, a period during which the paintings would necessarily be out of formal, secured storage and in the temporary custody of family members managing the practical logistics of her affairs. She had not voiced this concern to any of her children directly. She had voiced it to Harold, specifically, and asked him to take a precaution that, at the time, seemed almost excessively careful and that none of us knew about until weeks ago. She had commissioned a complete, independent photographic and forensic documentation of all 31 paintings, conducted by a third-party conservator with no connection to our family, 8 months before her death. Full high-resolution photography. Detailed condition reports. And, critically, microscopic pigment and canvas fiber samples taken from each painting, properly documented and sealed, stored in Harold's firm's secure records, completely separate from the collection itself. She told Harold, according to his notes from their meeting, which he shared with me, I trust my children. I love them. But I have watched families come apart over inheritances my entire life, and I have learned that trust and documentation are not opposites. The documentation simply makes sure the trust doesn't have to carry more weight than it should. She had not done this because she suspected Patricia specifically. Harold was clear about that, and I believe him. She had done it because she understood something general about inheritance, large assets, and the particular vulnerabilities that exist in the window between a person's death and the formal closure of their estate. She had built a safeguard not against a specific threat, but against the general possibility that something might happen during a period when the collection would, necessarily, be less protected than it had been throughout her lifetime. Harold released this documentation to me, with the estate's formal authorization, in early May. I compared the pigment and fiber samples from my grandmother's 2020 pre-death documentation against the 11 paintings I had already identified as forgeries. The samples did not match. Conclusively, scientifically, undeniably. The paintings my grandmother had photographed and sampled 8 months before her death were not the same paintings currently hanging in my father's, my uncle's, and my Aunt Susan's homes. I now had everything. Gregory Pell's confirmed commission. The technical forgery analysis I had conducted independently, and my grandmother's own forensic documentation, gathered specifically to protect against exactly this kind of substitution, conclusively proving that 11 genuine Hartley paintings had been photographed and sampled in her final months, and were no longer the paintings in the family's possession. What remained was Patricia's 8 paintings, which she had still, at that point, refused to allow me to examine. I want to tell you about the conversation I had with my father before anything else happened, because it matters to understand that I did not move toward confrontation lightly or quickly. I drove to Winnetka in early May and sat with my father at his kitchen table and walked him through everything. The forgery confirmation, Gregory Pell's account, my grandmother's forensic documentation, the financial trail I had begun reconstructing through Patricia's private dealer sales, which by that point I had traced to a combined value exceeding $1.4 million across the 11 sold originals. My father listened in near complete silence for the better part of an hour. When I finished, he sat with his hands flat on the table for a long moment before he spoke. He said, "Patricia stood up at Madeline's engagement dinner and told everyone you were responsible for this." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "She let everyone believe your appraisal was the problem." I said, "I know." He said, "And the entire time, she knew exactly what had actually happened, because she was the one who made it happen." I said, "Yes." My father is not a man who shows much emotion in front of other people, and I want to tell you that what happened next, at that kitchen table, is something I will remember for the rest of my life. He put his head in his hands, and he was quiet for nearly a full minute, and when he looked up, his eyes were wet in a way I had only seen once before at my grandmother's funeral. He said, "Your grandmother trusted Patricia with that house for 18 months because Patricia was the one who offered, the one who said she'd handle it, the one who made it seem like a sacrifice she was generously making for the family." I said, "I know, Dad." He said, "And the entire time, she was." He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to. I want to tell you about the family meeting, because it did not happen the way these things sometimes happen in dramatic, public settings. It happened in my father's living room, on a Sunday afternoon in late May, with my father, my Uncle James, who flew in from Arizona specifically for this, my Aunt Susan, and Patricia, all present. I had prepared everything the way I prepare any formal authentication dispute, complete documentation, organized chronologically, with copies for everyone present. I said, I need to walk everyone through what I've found over the past several months regarding the Hartley collection. Patricia's expression, from the moment I said this, had the particular stillness of someone who already understands, with complete certainty, exactly what is coming and has simply not yet decided how she intends to respond to it. I presented everything. The forgery confirmations across 11 paintings. Gregory Pell's commission record. My grandmother's pre-death forensic documentation conclusively proving the substitution occurred during the 18-month custody window. The financial trail showing private sales totaling approximately $1.4 million, traced to accounts associated with Patricia. I said, I would like to examine your 8 paintings now, Patricia, given everything we know. She did not answer immediately. The room held the particular silence that exists when everyone present already understands what an answer would mean and is simply waiting to see whether the person being asked will say it out loud or continue pretending there is still room to deny it. She said, finally, I needed the money, Robert. James paid for nothing when Mark's college fund came up short. Susan never once offered when my roof needed replacing. I was the one who managed everything for 18 months, completely alone, while all of you went on with your lives, and nobody offered me anything for it. My Uncle James said, "Patricia, that does not mean you had the right to steal from all of us." She said I didn't steal. I took what was already going to be mine eventually, just sooner, in a form that worked better for what I needed. I said, "Patricia, you sold paintings that had been allocated to Dad, to James, to Susan. Not to you. You didn't take something that was already yours sooner. You took something that belonged to 3 other people and replaced it with forgeries so they wouldn't notice." She did not have an answer to that. She looked at her hands for a long time. Then she said, "And you let everyone believe it was your fault at Madeline's dinner." I said, "Vanessa was the one who appraised the collection. If something is wrong with those paintings, that's on her professional judgment." I said it back to her exactly as she had said it 3 weeks before this meeting, in front of 41 people. She did not respond to that either. I want to tell you what happened in the weeks that followed, because the resolution of this is not a simple, satisfying conclusion, and I think it matters to be honest about that. Patricia's 8 remaining paintings were examined. 6 were genuine. 2 more were forgeries, bringing the total to 13 substituted paintings rather than 11, all from Patricia's own allocation and the portions she had managed during the custody window. The financial reconstruction, conducted with the estate attorney and, eventually, forensic accountants brought in to formalize the documentation for what would become a civil matter, confirmed total proceeds from the private sales at $1.6 million after accounting for the additional 2 pieces. Patricia has agreed, through her own attorney, to a structured restitution arrangement that will return the financial value of the sold paintings to my father, my Uncle James, and my Aunt Susan, proportional to what was taken from each of their allocations. This arrangement is being formalized through civil proceedings rather than criminal prosecution, a decision my father and my uncle made together, after lengthy discussion, weighing the practical realities of pursuing criminal fraud charges against a family member against the more straightforward path of financial restitution. I want to be honest that I do not fully agree with this decision. I believe what Patricia did meets every standard of criminal fraud, and I believe accountability sometimes requires more than financial restitution. But it is not entirely my decision to make, and I respect that my father and uncle and Aunt Susan have to live with whatever choice they make about their sister in a way that extends beyond this single incident. What I can tell you is that the 11, now 13, original Hartley paintings remain unrecovered, sold into private collections through channels that, even with everything we now know, will be extraordinarily difficult to fully trace and reclaim. Some of that value may eventually be recovered through the art recovery networks I work with professionally. Much of it, realistically, may not be. What was recovered, completely and conclusively, was the truth. My grandmother's forensic documentation, gathered quietly, without suspicion of anyone specifically, simply out of a lifetime of understanding how inheritances can come apart, did exactly what she built it to do. It did not prevent the theft. But it made the theft undeniable once it was finally examined. And it cleared my name, completely and conclusively, of an accusation that had been allowed to stand unchallenged for 3 weeks at a family dinner by the one person who knew, with absolute certainty, that it was false. Like they always say, the people who steal from the people they love always assume that confidence will be mistaken for innocence indefinitely. They rarely account for the fact that somewhere, often quietly, often years in advance, someone who loved the same things they were stealing was already building the proof that would eventually outlast every confident denial. My grandmother did not build her forensic documentation because she suspected Patricia specifically. She built it because she understood something true about inheritances and trust and the particular vulnerabilities of the period when something valuable changes hands without anyone watching closely enough. She was right to understand that. And, because she was right, 3 years and 1 accusatory dinner later, the truth was still recoverable, sealed in a law firm's secure records, waiting for someone with the training to read it correctly. I had that training. She gave me that training, one summer afternoon at a time, in a carriage house in Lake Forest, teaching an 8-year-old how to truly see a painting. I read the evidence correctly. It took 3 years, 11 forgeries, and a confident accusation made in front of 41 people. But I read it correctly. My name is Vanessa Cole. I am 33 years old. I am a senior fine art appraiser and authentication specialist at Whitcomb Fine Art Appraisals in Chicago. I keep my grandmother's brass loop in the top drawer of my desk. I have not needed it for the technical work in years. I keep it because some instruments are not about function. Some are about remembering who taught you to see. The Hartley paintings that remain in my family's possession, 18 of the original 31, the ones that were never substituted, hang in my father's home, my Uncle James's home, and my Aunt Susan's home, exactly where my grandmother intended them to be. Patricia's portion is held in trust now, pending the restitution arrangement's completion, administered by Harold Whitfield's firm. I think about my grandmother constantly through all of this. I think about the patience she brought to building that collection, one painting at a time, across 53 years. I think about the quiet, almost excessive care she brought to protecting it in her final months, not because she suspected anyone specifically, but because she understood, generally and wisely, how easily trust can be exploited in exactly the windows when no one is watching closely. She protected the truth before anyone knew it would need protecting. That is my story. One collection. 11, then 13, forgeries. One accusation made in front of 41 people. And one woman's quiet, forensic foresight, sealed in a law firm's records for 3 years, waiting for someone trained well enough to read it correctly. If this reminded you that the people who built what you're protecting often understood, long before you did, exactly how it might need protecting, share this with someone who needs to hear it. Drop a comment. Tell me what moment hit you hardest. Hit subscribe. And I will see you in the next one.